Welcome to the Space Forum podcast, and today we've got a very special guest. I'm delighted to welcome Lafayette Greenfield, who's from the law firm Gibson Dunn in Washington, D.C. Lafayette, first of all, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ralph. I'm very happy to be here.
Now, I've been looking at the space industry stats, and right now the industry is worth about $570 billion. It's dominated by the US, but there are also some other major growth areas around the world. But this industry is expected to treble in size by 2035. I just wonder if you could give us a sense of the opportunity for companies looking at this industry right now.
I think right now is a really exciting time in space, particularly for investment and particularly for companies that are interested in engaging in the industry and potentially innovating and creating new products and service offerings in the industry. I think it's interesting because space used to be something that was simply about the moon and rockets and astronauts. And now it's truly about infrastructure, right? So you have satellite constellations that are being launched to the sky and to provide connectivity. You have concepts like orbital data centers that are new, that are particularly exciting. You also have direct-to-device, which is coming, and it's going to provide a new service offering that's really more like a traditional telecom offering. So there's so many ideas out there now, and particularly with AI and the cloud being connected to satellite, the convergence between terrestrial infrastructure and satellite infrastructure.
Just a reminder to subscribe to this podcast, like this episode, and tell a friend or colleague. We're building a community of people just like you who are interested in space policy, regulation, and innovation. And we'd like to make sure you're the first to hear when we produce new content. Forum Global are also a leading organizer of events around the world. For more information and to come and meet the team, check out forum-global.com. Now, back to the conversation.
I think the opportunity is huge because I think companies and other industries, particularly in agriculture, maritime, airline connectivity, are going to be relying on satellite. And that's why I think you're seeing so much of a boom in the area.
Yeah, it's not so much space, the final frontier, as space, the new frontier, isn't it? There's a huge amount of opportunity. I just want to dig into a couple of those areas. So I've become very much aware recently of direct-to-device. So we're starting to see cell phone providers working with some of the major satellite providers to give that extra bandwidth to users. Is that one of the big growth areas you're seeing? 30 years ago, I wonder, were we seeing quite so much innovation in the space area?
No, I don't think we were. And I think partly 30 years ago, satellite was a lot more niche. You had geo satellites. They were large. They were not launched at the scale that they're being launched now. They typically were providing much more specific and niche offerings, particularly as it relates to connectivity. And I think now with the advent of cell phones and this kind of Internet of Things and global connectivity, direct-to-device, I think, is actually going to be transformational. We're starting to get to the point now where I think it's definitely going to be something that companies are able to pull off. SpaceX has announced deals with telecom carriers, and there's other companies that have direct-to-device that they're considering and offerings that they're intending to provide. And I think what's great about it is internet connectivity is actually not great. And I think it's partly not great because most people rely on fiber, and it takes a lot of capital to lay fiber. You need to have the right terrain. And so you need to have a business case as well. So most companies are not going to want to lay fiber in a town of only 1,000 people or an island that has a lower population. So satellite connectivity is going to be huge. And then if you connect it to the device where most people are doing so much on their phones now, you can see how it could be really particularly transformational. Whereas a satellite connectivity offering was something that you might offer to just a ship, or you were connecting to airlines and the service wasn't particularly great. Now you're starting to see how it could develop into a true telecom global offering where people's devices are going to be connected to satellite. And then if you look further on into the future, if you need to have things like autonomous vehicles and all of the things that rely on the internet, the more you can fill those coverage gaps, the more I think a lot of those ideas are going to come to fruition.
Yeah, I love that phrase, coverage gap. I'm using a satellite connection right now. The price is comparable to a fiber connection. Now, you mentioned something earlier, which was orbital data centers. So I love there are so many kind of, I don't know if you want to call them space puns, but this idea that the cloud really is in the cloud. So the data center is up above us. Just tell us a little bit about that. Is that really happening right now?
Yeah, it is. And there's been a lot of reports now. I think Google is starting to do this. Elon Musk mentioned that Starlink satellites would have some compute and storage devices in the future. And there's other companies as well that are considering over data centers. And it's one of those pie in the sky ideas that I think people didn't even think about even just a year ago or 2 years ago. But I think when it comes to data centers, the reality is a lot of the AI training and modeling and the data in the cloud is becoming so vast that there aren't enough data center spaces on Earth. So you're seeing these concepts now where they're trying to find ideas to be able to create data centers in other places. Space is one. I've also heard about data centers that are going to be placed in the sea. And it's truly an interesting idea. Now, who knows if it's truly going to work? I don't think anybody has come out with a commercial offering yet, but it's definitely there. And I think as we've seen in this space, and no pun intended, a lot of the pie in the sky ideas do come to fruition. And I think it does make sense because of the convergence between all of these technologies. A satellite is connected to a ground station or a data center on the ground. It's going to be processing cloud images and other things that need AI. And so having the processing power and the compute power in space makes sense. And it makes sense not only just for geospatial processing images and other AI uses, but it also makes sense because you have really large constellations now, and it's an easy way for the constellations to be able to communicate with each other, for example. It's exciting. Who knows if it's truly going to happen at a large scale, but it's one of those ideas that I think makes the industry very exciting because there's so much innovation now.
I find it fascinating. The fact that you can go out and look, if you're lucky enough to live in a dark sky area, and often you can see, for example, the Starlink satellites, is something that 15 years ago you didn't see. It's a fascinating sort of engineering puzzle that's going on at the moment. But I want to ask you, talking of puzzles, about the legal framework. So you're based in the US, I'm in Europe, as you pointed out. What happens with space? How does it work from a legal point of view? Is it just US law that counts, or do you have to consider kind of multiple things when you're building a new startup?
Especially now, most space businesses are global. If you have a constellation that's providing satellite connectivity services, for example, you're probably going to be trying to provide those in more markets than just the US. So US law matters, and there's a communications framework in the US that's governed by the FCC, where there's licensing and regulatory obligations, but there's also different frameworks around the world. And you're going to have to, at least in all of the places where you intend to do business, figure out what those frameworks are. And they can vary across industries. And I think what's also important to know is that some countries are lagging behind others when it comes to these legal frameworks. And while some of those frameworks rely on US or other Western nations frameworks, they tend to develop their own frameworks. So there's a lot to consider when you have a global business. And then you also have the ITU, which is the UN global body that governs satellite communications as well. And depending on where you do business and where you register, you'll also have to deal with the ITU and the ITU radio regulations. And that's how satellite companies from different nations are required to coordinate their communications with each other and deal with their disputes. Yeah, it's a complicated framework. And I think that's why lawyers are incredibly important in the satellite industry. And I think even more so than others because the framework is complicated. The technologies are evolving, so the frameworks are evolving all the time. Just by default, most satellite businesses are global businesses. It's starting to get a lot more complex and complicated.
So if you're building a company in this area, whether it's a startup, a scale up, an established business, what are some of the top things you should be thinking about when you're considering both the law, but also, I suppose, the regulatory environment as well?
Yeah, I mean, there's the law. And I think one of the things that's definitely important, even outside of the law, is honestly capital. The reality is most space projects are going to require a large amount of capital, which means you're going to need to have investors. You may need to get financing from banks. And the projects tend to have very long development cycles because you're launching rockets. You have to schedule those launches. There's so much, I think, you have to do to build a space business that you're definitely going to need a lot of capital. And whether that's coming from venture capital or whether that's coming from traditional financing from banks, or whether you're like the Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos of the world, whether you're funding it out of your pocket, it's definitely capital intensive. So if you're starting a new satellite business, marketing that business, trying to get investment, that's probably going to be your number one goal, even outside of the law. And then when it comes to the law, as I mentioned earlier, satellite business is definitely different than other businesses. And there's definitely businesses that are heavily regulated, similarly to satellite. But I think with respect to satellite, the regulation is almost baked into the business model. As I mentioned before, you have to figure out where you're going to be doing business. There could be advantages to domiciling or registering your company in an industry outside the US, for example, because eventually you're going to have to register your satellites with the ITU, and who that nation you choose is. There could be advantages and pros and cons to the nations that you pick. There's also going to be the regulatory approval process. That's also going to determine where you want to do business and how you're able to do business. If you intend to have a global business, what that means is you're going to have to do surveys of what the regulations are in those places. And in some places, particularly if you have a new technology, for example, just throwing one out there, if you're interested in asteroid mining or mining rare earth materials on the moon, not only is the exercise going to be trying to figure out even if there are regulations that apply, but you're also going to have to do some upfront work in terms of maybe lobbying or talking to regulators, talking to government, how they need to regulate these things. And in some senses, you'll have a first mover advantage at the end of the day because the frameworks won't be so developed. But at the end of the day, you do have some obligation up front to be able to communicate with regulators, tell them about your technology so that you can get the best type of regulation for you to run a good business. Regulation is definitely important. I think another thing that's incredibly important is geopolitics and national security. If you're in the US, there's so many national security regulations like export controls, CFIUS, and other regulations that can apply in this context, particularly as it relates to sensitive and new and advanced technology. So that's also going to be something you're going to have to consider. If you're a hardware supplier and you've created a new hardware that's going to be used in an orbital data center, for example, and you're US based and you want to sell it abroad to other companies, there's going to be tons of US regulations that are going to dictate how you sell that technology and who you can sell it to. So those are all things I think you have to figure out. And that's one of the big challenges. And then in addition to that, of course, there's contracts, right? You got to figure out what the business model is. If you have a new idea, who are the customers going to be? Is it going to be government? Is it going to be direct to the consumer, like direct to device? Are you going to do a business to business type service? And then outside of that is also IP is big. Data privacy is going to become bigger. Cybersecurity is going to be huge. So compliance, regulatory compliance, capital, contracts, all of those things are going to be things you're going to want to consider and honestly try to figure out very early on, because it's really truly going to be baked into your business model.
And that's probably a good time for me to ask you about your firm, Gibson Dunn, as well. So for people who don't know you, maybe are outside of the US, just give us a sense of the services that you offer.
It's interesting with law firms that operate in this space, and I keep using space and there's no pun intended there, but with law firms that operate in this area, you have certain lawyers like myself that have a specific practice that's focused on the industry, that has expertise on the industry. But I think one thing that's important to note is a satellite company is also just a regular company. And they have tons of legal needs, whether that's IP needs, M&A needs, financing needs. So other lawyers are almost always engaged in the industry, even outside of your satellite experts. And I think I just got to Gibson Dunn. And part of the reason why is because I think it's a really good platform. These businesses all have different needs, whether those needs be regulatory or contract based or transactional financing. And Gibson really offers all of those services. And it has a global presence to where if you are operating internationally, you could effectively look at it as almost a one-stop shop. So the way I think about it is if a satellite company comes and they have tons of needs, it's not only that they're just going to be able to utilize me and my satellite expertise, but they'll also be able to take advantage of all of the other offerings that the firm has. And the firm is great for M&A. The firm is great for transactional work. It has a global presence. Yeah, no, it's definitely a great firm and we're looking to expand in the area. And I think we definitely have a lot to offer from a legal perspective.
So, talking about the globalization aspect, you touched upon export controls, controls of things like chips. On top of that, the various different sort of regulatory frameworks that you've got to be involved with. That seems pretty complicated. Is it getting more complicated now that this industry is such a sort of hot area to be in?
Yeah, I think it is getting more complicated. And not only just with respect to the regulatory and cross border investment and national security issues you have, and how geopolitics interplays with all of this. It's also supply chains, right? It's like most supply chains now are global. A lot of the companies that are offering hardware that you need are going to be located in jurisdictions outside of the jurisdiction you're located in. So most of the components, the hardware, they're all sourced globally. And that's definitely something you're going to have to consider. And then obviously that creates supply chain risk as well. So globalization is really impacting not only just how these businesses operate, but from a law firm perspective on how you're providing advice, because that's what's great and why I mentioned earlier that the firm is global, because it's not just going to be me that's going to be providing a client advice. And it may even be another law firm, right? If you're trying to operate in a jurisdiction, I'll throw one out there, Nigeria, right? You're going to need a local counsel on the ground that's going to be helping you figure out the regulations, how to get a license there, how to operate there, how to consummate contracts in that jurisdiction. So truly it's becoming a space where legal advice is not confined to even one country's laws or one law firm, but you're starting to use multiple law firms. You're starting to have to deal with multiple laws, multiple frameworks, multiple different countries where you're negotiating contracts. So it's definitely getting more complicated. And I definitely think it does impact the legal advice that you're going to receive as you operate in the space.
We've covered some of the sort of classic things you would think about when you're building a company. I want to just touch upon policy and regulation a little bit as well, because I know that in your past, and I guess even now, you've dealt heavily with digital transformation, with digital legal issues. Policy is often quite delayed from the things that are happening within the industry. So right now we're in this massive race for AI, for example. And I think we're only really dealing with privacy issues from perhaps 5 years ago, effectively with some of the policies and regulations. So there's always this sort of policy lag. How are you seeing policy develop in the space area? And what would your advice be to policymakers, maybe in the US or elsewhere, who are looking at this area thinking, crikey, this is just going to explode over the next few years? What should we be focusing on?
It's a great question. And I think people like to complain about the regulators, and I'll defend them here. They really truly have a difficult job. I think the pace of technology is starting to grow so fast particularly in the last 10 to 15 years, that trying to keep up and create regulations, particularly with governments being so bureaucratic and so many processes needed to create legislation and regulations around new technologies, there definitely is a lag in some of the regulations and what you're starting to see. Innovation is really starting to outpace the regulatory rule books in a sense. Constellations of the thousands of satellites, orbital data centers, and orbital servicing, these things weren't contemplated when a lot of the laws were created to govern satellite in space. It's definitely an area that I think is uncertain. That's one of the things you have to consider is there's some regulatory uncertainty. If you're coming into the business and you operating a new company and you want to provide satellite connectivity, yes, there's definitely some regulations around satellite communications, and particularly in the US and in Western nations, they're relatively well developed and you'll have some sense of what regulations are going to apply. But if you come in with a newer idea, mining minerals on the moon, then that's going to be something where there's going to be a lot of uncertainty about how it's going to be regulated. There may even be some regulators or governments around the world that may not like the idea. And that's why I mentioned earlier, there's going to have to be a lot of engagement. If you're thinking, at least from a company's perspective, is you need to engage with the regulators. And I know the question was really more about what the regulators should be doing. And I think it goes both ways. The companies need to be engaging with the regulators and telling them about the technologies, trying to figure out ways with governments around the world on how to regulate some of these new advanced technologies. And then the regulators also, the Space Forum is one of these examples of regulators doing that. They have to engage with industry. They have to figure out what's going on, and they need to start thinking about where their rule books are lagging behind and how to update them. You're seeing this now in the US, and the FCC is making a very big push in the Space Bureau to update their regulations. And I think it's because they realize and acknowledge that we're behind here. And not only are we behind, but we're creating some difficulties for people in the industry because they're coming into the industry. They have great ideas. Our government definitely wants to encourage innovation, encourage new ideas, but if you don't know what the regulatory frameworks are, and the regulatory frameworks are highly complicated. Like, for example, in the US, to get a launch license, you have to go to the FAA. To get radio authorization, you have to go to the FCC. There's export control and national security regulations that the Department of Commerce, even just mentioning all of those, and that's not all of them. So there's so many different regulations that apply. There's different regulators from different government branches. And that just creates this kind of complex mess. So if I was to advise the regulators, and it's not just regulators, because it's legislators as well, we have to start thinking about ways that we can protect the government's interests, obviously have regulation that makes sense, but not make it so difficult for people in the industry that they have to go get 10 different licenses from 10 different regulators, for example. The other thing that regulators need to consider is also there should be some flexibility, right? It's not that there shouldn't be hard and fast rules and rules that apply, but some flexibility out there that if there's a new technology that comes in, then there needs to be a quick review process on how you're going to handle these things, how they're going to be licensed, and how flexible you're going to be within your current frameworks to be able to accommodate a new technology.
Yeah, great points. Let's talk about the future then. So I've already said this market's going to treble in value. The US dominates at the moment for obvious reasons if you're interested in this area. But there are other parts of the world that are growing as well. So I was reading recently about Brazil, kind of hub for Latin America. What do you think the future holds, and where are you most excited about the future, but also what are some of the things that we perhaps need to be careful about as well?
Yeah, I think the future is very exciting. The pace of technology is getting so fast. When I was a child, the notion that you could get on your phone and talk to somebody and see their face and have right in your pocket a device where you can call your family and friends who are far away and still see them. I mean, none of us contemplated any idea like that now. And now I feel like technology is advancing so fast that there's something new and exciting that's happening every couple of years. Like I said, orbital data centers was not something that I even heard anyone mention 2 years ago. And we're just hearing about it now. And I bet in 2 years, they're going to be existing and they're going to be operating completely. So the industry is exciting. The future holds a lot. And I think you mentioned Brazil and some other countries. And I do think that's why the direct to device thing is so big, because it takes what were these kind of niche satellite offerings that were only offered to niche markets, right? Like agriculture and maritime. And they were really business to business type services that were being offered. And now you're creating something where satellite is going to be not only just offering business to business services, but direct to consumer services. And when you're in a market like Brazil, where there's a high population in Brazil, there's tons of people who have cell phones and are connected, then the business opportunity in some of these places is vast, because it's going to be able to provide, I think, a traditional type telecom service to people globally, which is something, again, that we really haven't seen before. And I think people don't realize, I think, how transformational that is, because not only is it that you could provide a direct to consumer service, but you're also in a world now where there's this convergence between all of these technologies, right? So you've got your satellite connectivity and it might be connected to your iPhone, just Apple recently announced. And now it's only providing emergency type services, but there's going to be a point where it provides really strong internet connectivity type services, right? So who knows? Maybe you get on your plane and you don't even need the airlines connectivity services, because you'll be able to connect to a satellite while you're flying in a plane. Or if you travel somewhere and you're on vacation and you want to go to Bali and the internet's not great, your phone will be able to connect directly to a satellite and provide you the service that you constantly, I think, need now, because so many of us are connected that it's almost as if the future is going to hold a lot. And I think the industry is starting to become a big player in the Internet of Things. And then again, it's because of all of the convergence of these technologies.
It's crazy how things have developed. I think I'm right in saying the first rockets or first satellites from Elon Musk's Starlink were kind of 2017, weren't they? I think. So here we are in 2025, and it's just another option. Certainly here, you can get your fiber connection, get a mobile connection, or get a Starlink connection. It's not even really something that is crazy and new. It's just accepted. So I think the more adoption of these services, the more fascinating it's going to become. And I am absolutely with you about the direct to device, because I think we're all sold on 5G or whatever mobile technology, and we all have those moments when it doesn't really work. So if satellite can fill in, that's going to be amazing.
I don't think we need to be scared of anything, but there's definitely going to be regulatory challenges. And I think the regulatory challenges are more complicated than even just satellite regulation, right? The more you start connecting satellites to data centers and AI and compute technologies, and there's going to be AI regulations that may need to be developed that will come into play. You're definitely going to have data privacy. We already mentioned national security, and IP is another one that's really going to be critical. So I think that's the one thing that's going to be a major challenge is you're launching more satellites. They're starting to get connected to everything. There needs to be some smart regulation about how all of this works. And it's not only just with respect to regulations that govern the satellite communications and connecting to AI, but also regulations that govern, you mentioned Elon Musk, but there's an interesting graphic that you can look up online that kind of shows all the satellites in the sky, and he's blanketed the sky already. That creates issues for the space environment. Satellites can collide into each other at the end of their life. How do you dispose of them? So orbital debris is another area that's going to be huge. And how do you make space sustainable? And those are all things that are major challenges that are going to have to be figured out. The more the Elon Musk of the world and people who are innovators in the industry come with new ideas.
Yeah, and I think that's also why it's so important to come and meet with experts like you. We put on a range of events. So there's the America's Space Forum, the European Space Forum and other events as well. But for now, Lafayette, I'd just like to say thank you for what has been an absolute masterclass in the legal, regulatory, policy, and technology things you should be thinking about. I agree with you that we shouldn't be worried about it. It's a fascinating area. It's so innovative. And I guess one person's challenge is another person's opportunity. So I'd just like to thank you for coming on the Space Forum podcast.
Thank you. I really appreciated our discussion.